Welcome to this AQA GCSE Geography warm-up video for Paper 3. This session deals with Section B of Paper 3, which is the Fieldwork section. Hopefully you already know when Paper 3 is taking place and what it includes, but here is the basic stuff that you need to know. There are two sections. Section A is the pre-release. This is worth 40 marks, including 2 6 markers and 1 9 marker. You then have Section B, which is questions on fieldwork. The unfamiliar fieldwork section is worth 16 marks. These are mainly low tariff questions, the highest tariff being 4, and familiar fieldwork is worth 23, including 1 6 marker and 1 9 marker with spag marks. This short video deals specifically with Section B. We are going to revisit the fieldwork inquiry process and think about the different aspects that you could be tested on. Remember, the fieldwork section is worth 39 marks in total. Before we move on, it's important to note that Section A has questions 1, 2 and 3 on this paper. Questions 4 and 5 are about fieldwork. So question 4 is about unfamiliar fieldwork and presents a series of data response questions varying between 1 and 4 marks. These are based on different fieldwork scenarios. You might be asked to complete a table of data or a graph, to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of a data collection method or sampling frame, or to suggest ways in which to improve a piece of fieldwork. Question 4 is worth a total of 16 marks. Question 5 is all about your own experiences of fieldwork. During the GCSE, you will have completed 2 contrasting fieldwork inquiries, a physical inquiry and a human fieldwork inquiry. Read the instructions carefully, as some of the questions specify which of your fieldwork inquiries they want you to talk about. The questions here are all about evaluating your own fieldwork inquiry. For example, you might be asked to assess how suitable your study sites were, what the risks were when you were collecting data, or how useful your data was at drawing conclusions. This section is worth 23 marks, which includes 1 9 marker and 1 6 marker. The 9 marker will have spag and they will test your own fieldwork. So we're going to start off with a round of altered vowels where we are going to show you various parts of the fieldwork inquiry. So we know these as fieldwork strands, and each of the fieldwork strands will feature in your examination. Now what we're going to show you is the stages of the fieldwork inquiry, but they've had their vowels removed so they look a little bit confusing. What we're then going to do at the end of this little quiz is we're going to talk through each one, talk about what it means and some potential questions that might come up. Right, let's have a go with our first one. So we're going to start off with a really confusing looking one. So this is what we do right at the beginning of the fieldwork process. Have we worked it out? I'm just going to give you a couple more moments. Let's have a look. It's developing an inquiry question or a hypothesis. Now remember, we're going to go through these in a bit more detail in a moment. Right, number 2. Hopefully a lot easier. Okay, we have data collection. So that was strand number 2. Here we've got strand number 3. What do we think this one is? Hopefully you're recognising it as data presentation. I'm going to move on to strand 4. Okay, let's have a look. It is data analysis. And then we've got strands 5 and 6 together. So what do we think these ones are? First one looks quite easy. Can we recognise the third word on the screen? And we put these together because they're often together in the exam. The conclusion and evaluation. So we're going to talk through these different strands, what they are and what you might need to consider in the exam with some example questions also. So we're going to start off by looking at strand 1. This is framing the inquiry, which basically just means selecting a suitable question for your geographical inquiry. So you either need to choose a key question to answer or a hypothesis to prove or disprove. And obviously it needs to be closely matched to the topic given to you by your teacher. And in reality, they've probably given you the actual question. But you just need to be able to answer in an exam situation why that question was chosen. You also need to think about the sampling methods that you use here, as well as the location for your fieldwork. So in the exam, you might be asked to think about the factors to consider when selecting your inquiry question. You might be asked about the theory or concept underpinning the inquiry. You might be asked about appropriate sources, primary and secondary data, and how any issues that arise at this stage could be reduced. Let's have a think about an example exam question here. And it might be justify the choice of your human or physical geography question / hypothesis, 4 marks. Now here is a really good place to start our recap of all sorts of different things to do with this first stage. A good place to start our recap is by reminding ourselves of the different types of data available to us. When planning a fieldwork inquiry, you need to think about what type of data will be the most useful to answer the inquiry question or prove or disprove the hypothesis. Data can be divided into 2 groups, quantitative data and qualitative data. Quantitative data is statistical data that is numerical and can be presented in tables and graphs. Quantitative data is in numerical form, so it's measurable and is easy to put into categories or into rank order. A good way of remembering what quantitative data is by using the first 7 letters of the word. Quantitative data is high in quantity, i.e. there's lots of it. Qualitative data, on the other hand, is data that is in words and is detailed, helping to provide context. Qualitative data gathers information that is not in numerical form. Instead, it is normally in words or sentences, such as old diaries, newspaper reports, interviews with people, and notes from observations. This data is usually very detailed and therefore quite time-consuming to collect. A good way of remembering what qualitative data is by using the first 6 letters of the word. Qualitative data is quality data. But there is also another way to categorise your data. So your fieldwork inquiry will usually use both primary and secondary data. Primary data is research information that you collect out in the field yourself. There are lots of different data collection methods available to us, and we'll have a look at those in a minute. Collecting primary data is time consuming, however you do collect exactly what you need, and in theory your data should be reliable. Secondary data is information that's been collected by someone else for another purpose. It is often used by geographers to back up their own fieldwork data. There are a range of sources of secondary data. Some of these are quantitative, such as official statistics like the UK census, whereas some will be qualitative, such as old diaries, books, newspapers, and other personal or historical documents. The biggest advantage of this data is that it already exists and it is easily available. However, it has been collected by someone else, so there are issues to consider. That data might be out of date, it could be biased, or it could simply be overwhelming as there's so much of it. When we're setting up our inquiry, we also need to think about the sampling methods that we use. Once again, you probably haven't had much say over this because of practicalities of fieldwork. It is likely that your teacher has chosen your sites for you, but you still may get a question asking you about certain sampling methods, and it may ask you what the benefits of them, and it may ask you to justify a sampling method that you used. So it's really important that you know about these sampling methods. So once you've decided what sort of data you want to find, you've got to decide where you're going to collect that data. And a sample is used in fieldwork as it's often hard or too time consuming to survey a whole area or to collect large amounts of data. So a sample is a survey of a small number of sites or people to gain an understanding of the characteristics of a larger area. The sites need to be representative of the area as a whole, so you can make generalisations after collecting your data. Let's have a look at some of the sampling techniques that you might get asked about. Our first one is random sampling. This is where the sites where data is going to be collected are selected at random, e.g. closing eyes and pointing to places on a map. There are lots of advantages to random sampling. It can be used with a large sample or sample area. It avoids any bias as it is totally random, and it is easy to carry the same fieldwork out again. However, data will not be evenly distributed, and there could be gaps in your data or areas missed, particularly if the study area is large, and some of the sites may be difficult to access. Our second sampling method is systematic sampling. This is where the sample is agreed upon using a specific rule when you're out in the field, for example measuring every 2 metres along a transect or surveying every 10th shop. There are lots of advantages to systematic sampling. Data is evenly distributed across an area, e.g. every 10th house. It is more straightforward than other sampling types, and it ensures a good coverage of the study area. However, the selected rule may not work out in the field. It may be biased in the results, as different areas or pieces of data do not have the equal chance of being selected, and it may not be representative. And our last sampling technique is stratified sampling. This is where a sampling frame is made up of subsets and is used to choose the sites. It needs to be representative and proportional to the total area, e.g. choosing 3 sites from each section of the coastline. There are lots of advantages to stratified sampling. It gets good coverage of the data or area, so the results are more representative. It can be used with other sampling techniques, and it is easy to compare subsets. However, you do need to research the area beforehand before you start data collecting in order to choose your sample, to check that your subsets actually work. And the proportion of subsets needs to be accurate, and bias can be introduced into the sample. So let's have a look at a couple of questions that you might get. In terms of sampling methods, you may be given a map extract and asked to suggest a sampling method for measuring something in particular. So this would be in the unfamiliar fieldwork section. So we've got the example of measuring traffic on the screen, along with 2 examples of low tariff questions. So suggest why systematic sampling would be useful here, and suggest a limitation to using this method. For the top question, systematic sampling would offer a good coverage of this urban area, and it could be organised in the classroom beforehand. In the second question, physical features such as the river may get in the way, which would affect the representativeness of that piece of data. Right, let's move on to strand 2, which is all about data collection. This is selecting, measuring and recording data appropriate to your chosen inquiry. You need to collect the primary data needed to answer your inquiry question. You must use a range of appropriate methodologies and be able to appreciate the usefulness and limitations of them. And you need to be able to support your own data with secondary sources. In the exam, you may be asked questions involving the difference between primary and secondary data, how you identified and selected appropriate physical and human data collection methods, and how you measured and recorded your data using different sampling methods. You may also be asked to describe and justify your data collection methods. So it's really important that you know the strengths and limitations of some of these collection methods. Once again, it is likely that you're using the methods that your teacher has told you to do so, but you can't just write that you were using those because they're the ones you were given. You've got to know about why they are useful. So an example question here might be justify one data collection method used for your human or primary physical fieldwork for 4 marks. So let's quickly remind ourselves of some of the data collection methods that are available to geographers and therefore might make an appearance in paper 3. We've got quantitative data, we've got some examples here of river channel measurements, groin heights to check the effectiveness of protection against longshore drift. We've got pebble size analysis, traffic counts and land use surveys. And then in terms of our qualitative data, we've got environmental quality indexes, Likert surveys, using photographs, images and sketches, quality of life surveys, and sustainable community assessments. And we're going to have a look at a few of these in a bit more detail. So let's start off by looking at the EQI, the Environmental Quality Index, in a bit more detail. The EQI uses opposite adjectives or descriptors like you can see on the screen. Students can be involved in selecting or writing appropriate opposite statements, and these statements can be used to capture the viewpoints of you when you are out collecting data. They can be used to investigate whether different groups of people hold similar or different opinions. In the exam, you might actually be asked to complete 2 or more lines of an environmental quality index in the unfamiliar fieldwork section. So, for example, giving 2 more opposite statements, or you might be asked to think about the limitations of this type of survey. In this case, the biggest limitation is that it is so subjective and it's open to interpretation, meaning that the results are less accurate. Another data collection technique that is based on opinions is the Likert survey. This assesses the strength of response to an issue, and they can be used to investigate whether different groups of people hold similar or different opinions about something. They're useful in fieldwork that investigates opinions about the concept of place, such as sustainability or risk or inequality. Again, for this type of data collection method, you might be asked to suggest strengths and weaknesses in the exam. They collect a lot of people's opinions very quickly. However, the closed nature of the survey means that we often don't know why somebody has that opinion. And there's not really anywhere on your survey where people can elaborate. So they can either click agree or disagree, but give you no reason for that whatsoever. So they're a little bit limited in their validity. In the exam, you might be given a physical geography scenario, such as measuring water depth at intervals across a river. Now, there are a couple of things that could come up regarding this method of collecting data. Firstly, there may be a question about the risk assessment aspect of this type of fieldwork. Think about the risks here, such as slipping on wet rocks or falling into the river. The question could also be about the accuracy of collecting data. This is a big issue with physical geography. You need to make sure, for example, that the tape measure is pulled tight across the river to make sure your depth measurements are as accurate as possible. However, there could be big rocks on the riverbed, meaning that you are measuring the distance from the water surface to them and not the actual riverbed. There are also problems with coastal data for collection, for example, when measuring groin heights to assess the effectiveness of protection against longshore drift. Missing slats on those groins could actually make the results inaccurate. Our next strand is strand 3. This is data presentation, which is all about selecting appropriate ways of processing and presenting fieldwork data. You need to be able to choose a range of graphical techniques to display the data you've collected. You've got to be able to discuss the advantages and disadvantages of these different techniques, and you need to remember that data should be as clear as possible. So in the exam, you will be expected to appreciate that a range of visual, graphical and cartographic, which is mapping, methods are available to you, and you might be asked to describe and explain your selection and accurate use of presentation methods. You could also be asked how you adapted presentation methods to suit your inquiry. An example question here would be explain how one data presentation technique used in your human geography inquiry helped you interpret the data. And that could be a 6 marker, so that's quite a tricky question. It is also likely that you will either be given some data and asked to suggest the best way to present it and why, or you might be shown a graph and asked to explain why that's the most appropriate way to present the data. So we're going to remind you of the different ways that you can present your data and their strengths and weaknesses. So let's start off with a bar graph. Bar graphs show the value of different categories of data as rectangular bars with different lengths. These bars should be equal width with a gap in between to show that the data is discrete and it can be categorised and not continuous. They are very quick and easy to draw. The different heights of the bars make them really easy to understand and make comparisons from. However, they can be difficult to read accurately if the scale is large, the data can be oversimplified, and they can only be used for discrete data, and quite often we see them being used inappropriately. Okay, let's move on to line graphs. So line graphs are used to show continuous data and are useful for showing trends over time. So for example, population growth or the number of tourists over time, which was one of the graphs in last year's pre-release booklet that you might have seen or done as part of your mock exams. So they are very quick and easy to plot and they're really simple to read. You can actually put multiple sets of data on one graph using different coloured lines, and that makes it easy to compare. But they are also often used incorrectly when a bar chart would have been more appropriate, when we should only use them for continuous data and nothing else. Right, another really popular data presentation technique is pie charts, and these are used to display segments of data according to the percentage share of the total value of data. The percentages are converted into degrees to plot them. So they are visually effective as it's very easy to compare relative proportions of each segment. However, they can overemphasize large values and therefore smaller values are not clear, and they can be really hard to read if there are too many categories. Lastly, you need calculations to plot them in the first place as they are only suitable for percentage data. Right, let's move on to histograms. So something we don't see very often, but they do come up occasionally. They look very similar to bar charts, but they use a continuous scale along the x-axis. So for example, time. There shouldn't be any gaps between the bars, so it makes them distinctive from bar charts, which is why bar charts should have the gaps so they don't get mistaken for histograms. Now you can accurately plot large data sets. They're really simple to plot, they're really simple to read and understand, and they show change over time. But again, they can only be used for continuous sets of data, so something that's measured over time, and they're often used instead of a bar graph when they shouldn't be. Many people don't know the difference between the two. You will quite often see scatter graphs in the exam, not just in paper 3, sometimes in paper 1 and 2. These let you see two sets of information at the same time. One's plotted along the x-axis and one is plotted along the y-axis. And the whole point of a scatter graph is to compare the relationship between the two sets of data. And we call this a correlation, which can be either positive or negative. So the positive aspect of them is that you can compare two sets of data to investigate a relationship. So for example, between development indicators in paper 2. But the difficulty of them is that you do plot a line of best fit, and this can be quite tricky to plot, especially if there are anomalies. There is also some confusion because in geography we expect that line of best fit to be a straight line, whereas in science it's often a curved line. Okay, we move on to compound line graphs. These show layers of data and are calculated by reading off the values between the adjacent lines, and the different layers are coloured to make them easier to compare. Now it's really easy to see which value takes up the biggest share or has changed the most over time. So a really good example would be if you looked up the UK's energy mix graph. But they are very difficult to read accurately and they're quite difficult to plot as you're not starting at the zero axis each time. Okay, let's move on to radar graphs. You may have used these for your environmental quality survey data, and they display different sets of data that are using the same focal point. Sometimes they are called star graphs. They're also occasionally known as radial graphs. So you can pop lots of data on one graph, and it's really easy to compare multiple data sets and individual variables because the bigger the shape in the middle of your graph, the better that area is. However, they are tricky to draw in the first place, so it's quite difficult to get the axes right and the scale right, and it's really difficult to spot anomalies on them. And our last data presentation technique is pictograms or pictographs. These represent data using symbols that are relevant to the data. So you might have a drop of water to show access to clean water, and they are one of the simplest ways to show data. Now their biggest advantage is that they are visually effective in terms of how they represent the data, and they're really easy to read and they're really easy to compare. However, the images can be quite confusing if they're not carefully selected, and it can be quite tricky to get that scale right when you're drawing them. Right, let's have a look at strand 4. This is data analysis, which is describing, analysing and explaining your fieldwork data. This is your interpretation of the data. You need to describe what you see and explain what you've learned from the data in relation to your inquiry question or hypothesis. This is where you would talk about any trends, examples, or anomalies, and this is where you might start to look at links between data sets. In the exam, you might be asked to describe, analyse and explain the results of fieldwork data. You might be asked to establish links between data sets or use appropriate statistical techniques and identify anomalies in fieldwork data. So an example question here might be assess the importance of establishing links between data sets in interpreting your physical geography fieldwork data for 3 marks. So we're going to move on to strand 5 and 6, the conclusion and the evaluation. These are often done together in the final exam and they're usually the focus of that 9-mark question. So what's the conclusion? Well, this is where you answer your overall inquiry question, you agree or disagree with your hypothesis. And you need to present evidence here to back up your decision, and you need to make sure that you don't contradict your findings. So how does the evaluation differ from the conclusion? Well, the evaluation is where you reflect on what went well in your inquiry and what could be developed further if you were to carry out the inquiry again. It's all about considering the validity and the reliability of the data that you collected. In the exam, you will be expected to draw evidence conclusions in relation to the original aims of your inquiry. You will also be expected to be able to identify problems with your data collection methods, limitations of the data collected, and suggest other data that might be used. You may also be asked to suggest the extent to which your conclusions were reliable, which does come up frequently. So an example question here is, for one of your geographical inquiries, to what extent did your results enable you to draw reliable conclusions in relation to the aims of your inquiry? We're going to finish off this video with some top tips for success with the fieldwork element of this paper. So firstly, make sure you know the titles of your 2 investigations. You need to write enough to give the examiner a clear idea of what your investigations are about, or if not, you're likely to lose marks. So for example, you cannot just write coasts as a title of your coastal fieldwork. What exactly were you looking to do? If an answer requires 1 example of something, only write about 1 in your answer. So it might be that you're asked about 1 data collection method. Don't write about all of them. If you're asked about 1, it needs to be the one that you are most familiar with, that you can write the most about. So think about a range of possibilities, then choose the one that best suits the question, which you can write well about. Make sure you know the difference between data collection and data presentation, which sounds a little bit silly, but every single year students get these 2 mixed up. Remember, if you're asked to justify something, you must give reasons for choosing it. It isn't just enough to describe what you did, which is what students often do in this paper. Just give a description of a data collection method when you're in fact being asked to justify why you used it. Remember that 9-marker is likely to ask you about the reliability of your conclusions. You need to think carefully about the journey that you've taken through your inquiry. So think about those 6 strands. Think about the methods that you used, how they affected your results, and how did your results inform your conclusions. Again, that's going to be part of your 9-mark question. And finally, how could you improve your methods, and what impact would this have on your results, and how would it make your conclusions more reliable? Again, that 9-marker is going to have an element of reliability about conclusions in it if it's not the main focus. So you do need to be able to suggest these different improvements. Well done for getting to the end. In this session, we have recapped the types of data, we've looked at methods of sampling, and we've discussed methods of collecting and presenting data, along with their strengths and limitations. Hopefully, this is going to help you maximise marks in the unfamiliar and familiar fieldwork section of paper 3. And the last thing from me is obviously to wish you the very best of luck in that exam.